everyone. Welcome to Wealth Redefined. I'm your host, Michael Reynolds, independent financial advisor, owner of Elevation Financial on the web at elevationfinancial.com. Today, we're going to discuss donor-advised funds. How to use a donor-advised fund in your financial plan. What is it? How's it work? All the ins and outs. We're going to talk about it today. I'll start the conversation by saying there are lots of ways we can make a positive impact on the world. That's something that is a big theme of mine, a big theme of my firm, is to make a positive impact on the world. How do we make a difference? We can do that through investing. We've talked about socially responsible investing in the past. We can contribute time, we can contribute other resources, and we can give money. We can give through financial gifts. So a lot of us are familiar with this. We're familiar with direct giving. We can give to nonprofits. We can give to organizations we support that do good work in the world. But there's not always a practical way to do direct giving for many. There are some challenges when it comes to donating directly to organizations, either from a tax standpoint or from the timing of it or other methods. So the timing of tax deductions is one consideration that comes up for some people. Now, I'll preface this by saying, my personal feelings on charitable giving is we don't do it for the tax deduction. We do it because we want to help. We want to make a difference. But if the tax deduction is available, we don't want to leave it on the table, right? So when it comes to tax deductions, if we want to incorporate that into our tax planning, we may want to make larger donations during periods of high earning or high income, but we might not be ready to give large lump sums to specific nonprofits at that point in life. So sometimes the timing of the contribution and the tax deduction is not always in alignment. Maybe simply because we haven't chosen ones that are important to us yet, or we may want to, space out giving over many years for whatever reason. So if long-term philanthropy is a goal, then, making sure funds last a long time could be important. Others, more kind of a practical consideration. Others sometimes shy away from giving to nonprofits because they don't want to, get bombarded with calls or mailings for more donations or invitations to all these events, and they just kind of get bombarded with stuff once they give, and they don't want to deal with that, unfortunately. Others, limit giving simply because it can be challenging to keep track of all the, the receipts, the documentation. It's just kind of a hassle if you want to do multiple giving campaigns through multiple nonprofits. It can be a hassle to keep track of, and they're kind of as a point of diminishing returns where we just kind of feel disorganized if we're doing too much. So all these reasons and more are kind of why the donor advised fund has become extremely popular for those who are charitably inclined. So what is a donor advised fund? Let's talk about what it is and how it works. So a donor advised fund is a tax advantage investment account used for charitable giving. Its primary feature really is that it decouples the tax deduction from the timing of the gift. So it's a type of account that allows the donor to contribute money into the account and receive a tax deduction for it, just as if the gift were a charitable donation. Then the donor can decide when the funds are used for donations to eligible nonprofits. There's no specific time frame that must be followed. Although I will say that many donor advised fund platforms or account providers do require some minimal level of activity. For example, you've got to give at least $50 every 5 years, or at least a certain percentage on a regular basis. There's got to be some level of activity in the account. So a donor advised fund is available to anyone. Unlike a family foundation, it's really easy to set up. It's a turnkey way to execute giving. And again, when compared to things like a family foundation, it's much easier to set up and open and maintain. It's kind of a very lightweight, kind of miniature version of the benefits you get from a family foundation. So it's really easy to set up. Pretty much anyone can activate one. So how does it work? So let's say you make a $50,000 contribution to your donor advised fund this year. So you could receive a tax deduction on that contribution this year. And then over the next 5 years, you could issue grants of $10,000 per year to nonprofits that you support. You receive the tax deduction all at once in that year you contribute, but you can do the gifting anytime you want. So again, it decouples the gifting part from the tax deduction part. And you can fund a donor advised fund with cash, or you can use other assets like securities, like stocks or investments. So with cash, you claim an immediate tax deduction of up to 60% of your AGI for those cash contributions. When it comes to investments or securities, the fair market value of the assets is what you use, and you can do up to 30% of AGI as a deduction. So a little bit different rules between cash and investments, but you do still get that deduction up to a certain percentage of your AGI. So a lot of times people will opt to contribute their appreciated investments, and that way they don't have to pay the capital gains tax on it. So let's say you've got some stocks or some mutual funds or investments with a basis of X, and the fair market value is Y. If you sold that and then use the cash to make contributions to your donor advised fund, you'd be paying capital gains on the sale. But if you contribute the assets directly, you bypass having to pay those capital gains, and they can be contributed directly to your donor advised fund. So if let's say your contribution exceeds the AGI limits, you can carry forward that excess for 5 years, so you don't lose it. You can carry that forward. Also, a donor advised fund can be invested. So it's not just a cash account, it's actually an investment account, just like an IRA or brokerage account. So you can invest the money inside of it in mutual funds, for example, and that way you can enjoy long-term potential gains from that. And the nice thing is, once the money is in the donor advised funds, the charitable assets grow tax-free. So it's a tax-free growth account, again, can be invested just like an IRA. One additional benefit that a lot of people like about the donor advised fund is that grants can be made anonymously, and that keeps you from getting added to a bunch of mailing lists for various nonprofits. Now, I hate to say this because we want to support nonprofits that are important to us, but sometimes, let's face it, we do get lots of mailings and calls, and we get on those email lists, and it can be a hassle. So if you want to kind of sidestep that logistical annoyance, then a donor advised fund lets you give anonymously very easily and keeps you off mailing lists. It's just a direct give without the hassle of being in their database. So what are some examples of why you might use a donor advised fund? What are some examples of use cases in the real world? So the real advantage of a donor advised fund is that it gives you much more flexibility over when you take the tax deduction and when the giving actually occurs. So why is this an advantage? So I've got a few examples here I'm going to walk through. I've got 3 different examples of fictitious, made-up families here that we're going to talk through. I'm calling the first one Ellen the Entrepreneur. I'm going to make up this name here. So let's say Ellen's a busy solo business owner. She works as a consultant. She's 45. She's a very high income, and therefore her tax bracket's very high. She maxes out her solo 401k for a tax deduction, but she still pays a lot in taxes because she has a very high income. So she plans to run her business for the next 5 years or so, and then scale back and semi-retire early, possibly kind of closing it down over time, working a light schedule, maybe a few clients. And at that point, she would like to start giving back to her community and focusing more of her time on philanthropy. So with the donor advised fund, Ellen can kind of front load her charitable contributions and take substantial tax deductions on those contributions, which will lower her tax bill while she's working full time in those high earning years. Then when she enters early retirement, she can use the donor advised fund to issue grants to the organizations that she gets involved with without affecting her cash flow, which is now lower because she's semi-retired. The giving's already done, basically. She's kind of done the giving up front. She's front-loaded that giving from a tax standpoint, and now all she has to do is decide kind of where it goes. And she has the freedom and flexibility to use her donor advised fund to issue those grants, but the giving's already been preloaded with a tax deduction in advance. So that's one example. Another example, I'm going to call these Commission Clarksons. Bob and Sally Clarkson are the names I'm going to use here for this couple. They both have fast-paced careers. Bob works on commission in sales. Sally works in tech, let's say. As a sought-after software developer, Sally is changing jobs every few years because she keeps getting better offers. She sometimes works at pre-IPO companies and startups and often receives substantial bonuses and stock option events, which makes her income fluctuate from year to year. Some years she'll have very high income, some years lower. And then Bob's sales job is also volatile because he's on commission. So sometimes it's a great year, other times it's a more modest year. So because of their careers, their income fluctuates wildly from year to year. So Bob and Sally love to contribute to their church and many nonprofits that are important to them. They want to commit to consistent support of these organizations. Using a donor advised fund, they can contribute more to their donor advised fund when their income is very high and less when their income is lower. So this kind of levels out their cash flow from a tax standpoint. So it allows them to keep their tax bracket and cash flow more consistent, and allows them to contribute to the organizations more consistently so the nonprofits they support can count on those recurring donations that don't fluctuate. So again, they're taking the tax deductions when it's appropriate or when they most want to, and they decouple that from the timing of the grant making to the nonprofits they support. So it's a nice way to kind of decouple the timing of the tax deduction from the actual giving. So a third couple I'm going to talk about. This fictitious couple is Pat and Alex. Pat Smith and Alex Henderson have 3 kids. Both work. Their household income is high. It seems like every year during holiday season, they try to make a point to make donations to nonprofits that are making an impact in their communities. But let's say they never find the time to do enough research. They want to help, but they're really just too busy to make the time to focus. Since all 3 kids are under 5, they're super busy. By the time they get home from work, it's just all they can do to get the kids ready for bed. I'm sure we've all been there. Many of us have been there anyway. So with the donor advised fund, Pat and Alex can simply make a one-time lump sum donation into the donor advised fund at the end of every year and take a tax deduction without worrying about the research part of it. They want to do research and kind of figure out which nonprofits really align with their values, but they just haven't had the time to do that. So they take the tax deduction now without worrying about doing the research. And then a few years down the road, let's say when their kids are older, they've got a little more time, the kids are more autonomous, their schedule frees up a little bit, they can start setting up their giving plan when they have more time to evaluate nonprofits that truly reflect their values. And now they can involve the kids and make it a family decision together as well. So as Pat and Alice get older, they can also update their estate plan to name their children as successor donor advisors. That way, when Pat and Alex pass, their children can take over supervision of the donor advised fund and continue that legacy of giving. So again, it's kind of like a lightweight family foundation in this case. Much easier to manage, more turnkey, simpler, and it's a way to kind of create a legacy of philanthropy in your family as well. All right, so let's talk about some of the rules and guidelines for donor advised funds as we wrap up here. So there is a lot of different sponsor organizations that facilitate opening a donor advised fund. A lot of the big name custodians will offer a donor advised fund. There are also kind of third-party platforms that will let you use any brokerage platform you want, but then couple it with their platform to manage the grant making and the donor advised fund administration. So each sponsor organization, has a set of rules for donor advised funds they manage. But in general, the following guidelines are fairly standard or consistent with most sponsors. So first, be aware, contributions to donor advised funds are irrevocable. This means that contributions can't be taken back once they're gifted. So it's not like a brokerage account where you put money in, you can take it back out. A donor advised fund it's a permanent contribution. You make a contribution, you can't take it back. It's irrevocable. Also, next, donor advised funds, they maintain advisory and grant making. I'm sorry, let me back up. The donor, the person supervising and setting up the donor advised fund, that'd be you, hypothetically. They maintain advisory and grant making privileges for the donor advised fund. Even so, though, once the assets are gifted to the account, they belong to the sponsoring organization. So let's say you open a donor advised fund with custodian XYZ. It's an account that you are supervising, but when you make a contribution into that account, technically the assets are now owned by custodian XYZ. So just be aware, that's a technicality. Doesn't mean that they won't do what you ask, but it's a technicality that the assets are no longer under your ownership. So there are no contribution limits on how much you can donate to a donor advised fund. Sponsors, however, the plan sponsor, or the sponsor organizer, basically the platform sponsor who opens the account for you, they might require a minimum contribution to start the donor advised fund or a minimum grant amount. So some custodians or some platforms have different levels of, minimum maintenance or minimum amounts. So just be aware they may vary. So here's the thing. All grant recommendations from donor advised funds have to be approved by the sponsoring organization. So again, a technicality. It's pretty rare, but a sponsor can block or reject or deny a grant recommendation if the donor doesn't abide by the organization's standards or guidelines. So again, it's pretty rare as long as you're giving to an approved organization. It's pretty rare that it'll be rejected, but it's possible. It is a technicality. And here's the thing. Here's kind of the guidelines. So the grants must go to a public 501c3 nonprofit organization recognized by the IRS. So you can't give grants to individuals. You can fund scholarship opportunities based on a defined set of student criteria. So there are cases where you can do scholarships, but in general, funds have to go to a public 501c3 nonprofit organization, which does include places of worship and religious organizations as well. Also, donors can't receive personal benefit from donor advised fund grant making. You can't have any kind of personal benefit that comes from that grant making. QCDs can't be made to donor advised funds. That's a qualified charitable distribution, which is a distribution from an IRA. So those can't be made to a donor advised fund. Those are some of the guidelines. So it's really important that you read the documentation from your sponsoring organization to understand the rules and the limits and guidelines before you open and contribute to a donor advised fund. So again, there's a lot of kind of common standards among all of them. These are kind of the general guidelines, but for the most part, if you're giving to a 501c3 nonprofit recognized by the IRS, which again includes places of worship and religious organizations. There's always exceptions, but in general, it does include those organizations. Then, for the most part, it's pretty rare that any kind of grant recommendation would be rejected. They pretty much follow your recommendations. So in practice, this does work pretty smoothly. So how do you decide if a donor advised fund is right for you? So there's really many cases where a donor advised fund can be a great tool for giving and tax management. A lot of times it's the high earners who are interested in philanthropy but haven't worked out the details yet. So again, people that are in high earning years, making high income, are concerned about reducing taxes, and then later in life their plan is to get more involved in philanthropy when they have more time. They can build up enough assets to retire early perhaps, or slow down a bit. They want to decouple the tax deduction from the timing of giving. That's a really great use case for a donor advised fund. So it's also a good tax planning vehicle for those with substantial embedded capital gains in their investments. So if you hold securities for more than a year, you've got capital gains, which you'll be taxed on when you sell those appreciated securities. So again, the fair market value can be donated, and you're not subject to capital gains tax. So you can basically bypass paying capital gains, at the same time make charitable contributions. So that's a nice feature and a use case for it. Also, the anonymous giving portion can be attractive to some people. It may be seem like a minor thing or a little bit, kind of a simple thing that's not too significant, but it is significant to many people. They don't want to mess with the hassle of getting all these mailing lists. They want to give 100% anonymously, and a donor advised fund really facilitates that anonymous giving very well. So donor advised fund has a lot of benefits. I think it's worth exploring for those interested in long-term charitable giving. And again, it's really easy to set up. The management's really easy to set up. It's pretty frictionless. So it's a really good type of vehicle for the donors and the nonprofits alike. So I think it has a lot of features that are often good for everybody. So that is a rundown on the donor advised fund, how it works. I think it's a great vehicle for many people. So check it out. If you have any interest in talking about donor advised funds, as always, feel free to reach out. You can reach me on my website, which is elevationfinancial.com, or send me an email. You can just email me at podcast@elevationfinancial.com. But again, I love chatting with people. It's no obligation, no pressure. If you want to go to my website, again, elevationfinancial.com, use that button on the homepage to book a complimentary money session. We can chat for 45 minutes or so. That's kind of the time I have set aside. You can put your questions in there. We'll talk about whatever questions you have, and no pressure, obligation either way. Just happy to chat. So with that, thanks for joining me today. As always, have a great day. We'll see you next time.